Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today's project is Cardinal Companion. It is a fun design that will just whisk you away to a winter wonderland. It is filled with unusual techniques, slick tricks, and helpful tips to make it quick and easy to create. Oh, and I didn't forget to add plenty of glittery sparkle. Be sure you watch until the end to see how simple and impressive this project is. I know you're going to love it. I always give my surfaces a quick coat of multi-purpose sealer, lightly sand it, and I know the paint's going to adhere well and it'll be super smooth. Starting out with Spa Blue, and I'm using my 3/4 inch oval wash, and I'm using a slip slap technique. And I'm using more the flat of the brush as opposed to the chisel edge. And I'm doing an X shape and laying the brush down at a slight angle. This process needs to be completed quickly. And so I'm using the Distress Mister to kind of mist it every now and then to keep the paint moist and movable. I did the Spa Blue and then I added a ring of Aqua Sky around that. Now I'm picking up some deep blue, deep midnight blue, a little bit of black green, and I will blend these all together, and the paint will be movable as long as it is moist. So I do hit it with my mister, which is just a super fine mist, and just slightly, I don't have a heavy touch, it's just a very light touch. And I can go back and go over it and soften, soften, soften. I am being aware to not bring dark paint into that middle bright area. And you can see I kind of slow down when I want to be a little more precise. To lay in the paint and block in those areas, I can go rather quickly, but to smooth the paint out, I'd slow down just a little bit. Pick up a little more black green. I want this bottom area to be dark, and this is my first application of paint. It's going to take 2 layers, and the first one always looks a little bit choppy. The second layer of paint is going to be absolutely beautiful, and I can work with this for a long time because I do mist it and keep that paint very movable. If you have problems with paint drying, you can also use a quick dry glaze medium to keep that paint a little more alive and movable before it starts to tack up. If it does happen to tack up while you're working on it, just let it dry and then go back over it and just kind of start over. And I'm bringing that darkness all the way around the outer edge, being careful not to pull it into that lighter area. And I think I do just a little bit, but I'm not too worried about it. Just blocking in that, I want that highlight area, that middle kind of left side, and then just to blend from light to dark and soften that down. And you can see how I'm using the flat, not the chisel edge of my brush to blend that paint together. And once I get that paint in there, pretty much like I want it, and you can see it got dark there, so I just cleaned my brush, went over it, and that just kind of softens it all together. This is my second layer, and I did speed up the video so that it doesn't take up a whole lot of time, but it's basically the same process. Started out with Spa Blue, did a ring of Aqua Sky around it, picked up some deep midnight blue to darken those outer edges, and you can see how much softer this is blending together and how much richer these colors, because they're not against that plain brown background. They just are a little more vibrant over top of that loose base that we just put in. And I can see how that black green is showing up. I want it darker towards the bottom. This is just a real easy way to add that in. And you can see I've got my mister bottle handy. You can tell if you need a little more moisture because the brush will start to drag. But look how softly that's blended together. I want to give the hint of a little bit of snowfall in the background. I'm using Aqua Sky and my splatter brush. I'm going to be adding more snowfall toward the end, but this will just give that hint of soft snowfall in the background. Picking up a little bit of Spa Blue, very loosely basing in the face area, and I just want to block in the colors. This is the first time I've painted this design. I know what I want it to look like in my head, but until I start laying the paint out, and I did trace on, I used that white chalk pencil to trace my line drawing on. If you get the pattern, you'll have a traceable that comes with the pattern. But this is how I'm just beginning to block those colors in, using aqua sky on the hat, spa blue on the face, and I'm using my 1/2 inch awesome angle. It allows me to have a nice sharp edge, and also I can cover it quickly. I was going to paint the scarf scarlet, but when I put it over top of that dark, it was very translucent, so I picked up a little bit of tea berry to base coat that in, and it's just a little more opaque. And picking up back into the spa blue just to lay in the shoulders, and I'm not painting it clear to the bottom. I just want it to kind of softly blend out. So once I get my placement in there, this paint is super thin and I can move it around, and as it dries it becomes much lighter, but I'll let it blend out towards the base, and you can see how much lighter that has become. Another coat of that spa blue just to brighten the face area, trying to get those strokes in there a little bit smooth on the face. On the shoulder and the body, I can let that be just a little bit looser, and my paint is very thin. Picked up some of that tea berry to base coat that hat band in, still using my 1/2 inch awesome angle. Not too worried about the right hand side, it's darker over there, plus it's going to have the greenery on it. Going in with a little more of the deep midnight blue, and this is going to add some shading underneath the hat brim, and I'll let that just kind of softly fade up to the top of the brim. And remember, these are first layers, so they don't have to be super dark and heavy. Going in with Payne's Gray on the crown of the hat, and you can see my paint is super loose. I can go in and just kind of lift any errors. Picked up a little bit of spa blue on the toe of my 1/2 inch angle, and I'm just highlighting that top edge of the brim. Deep midnight blue to darken the shadowing under the hat, along the right side of the face, and also across the bottom. And this is such a light, little bit of paint makes such a big difference. So it's a very thin, you can see all the reflection from the water. You can tell how thin the paint is. There'll be a little bit of a shadow on his chest just below the scarf. Now I'm going in with Snow White, and you can see, wow, it looked bright before, but with this you can see how much brighter the face is going to become. And I do want the face area to be super bright. Whenever there's a face in a design, it's going to draw all the attention, so that needs to be as bright as possible. This is another just a loose application of paint, and I thought I would let the snow on his chest be a little bit, I don't want to say piled, but very much like a drift. Going in with True Red to brighten up the scarf. I don't want it pink. I want it to be nice and bright and Christmassy. And so I'm just putting that True Red over top of that tea berry. What a beautiful combination. I really like the way that glows. It just really works well together. This is the first time I've used tea berry with True Red, and I like the results of that. Added just a hint of Snow White to brighten that left side. My light comes from the top left, so I can pop some highlights in there. A little bit on the rim of the hat, and also on the top of the crown of the hat. And loosely more Snow White, and you can see as it dries it becomes so much more muted. And I like that this is kind of what I call chopping it in. It's very loose, and it gives like a fluffy look. picked up some black cherry to add shading on the scarf, and that pretty much goes on the bottom, and the right side's always going to be a little bit heavier. Kind of create the look of folds. And my scarf is wrapped rather loosely, so it's not real smooth and perfect. Pulling some of that black plum into the hat band, and a little bit under his chin where it's darker. And it just makes sense when you think about it, where the highlights top left, the shadow is going to be bottom right. Now I'm pulling in that scarlet, and this is a wow color. Very bold, very bright, but it still maintains that beautiful red glow. Picked up my 12 diverse dry brush and loaded it with Snow White, starting in the middle of the face, and I'm pouncing. So the bulk of the paint's going to be in the middle of the face, and I pounce around. It becomes lighter toward the outer edges. So I want the middle of the face to be the strongest, and then as it goes toward the sides, it's a little bit more subdued. And it creates a beautiful fluffy texture. It's just a fantastic brush. The bristles are just a little bit stiffer. They're great for dry brushing, also super great for texture. And I can dry brush on the hat and add a little more on his chest. It's a fun brush to work with. It creates some really unusual results very quickly, very easily. When it dried, it needed a little more brightness, and you can see how much brighter that second layer of paint on the face becomes. And I do want his little face to be super bright. And just a touch more on the left side of his chest. I don't want all of it to be bright. I did take my pencil and just kind of mark where I wanted the nose and the eyes, using my number 2 Radical Round and Warm Sunset just to paint that nose in there and create that nice carrot shape. I'm using my Painter's Pal template and my number 4 Spectacular stencil brush, loaded it with soft black. Wiping it on a paper towel to get rid of the excess paint means I'm going to have perfect eyes, and they're going to be identically shaped. And I just take that little dot and I center my template right over that dot, and I know exactly where my placement will be. Now I did go back and add a second coat after this dried. Loaded my Epic script liner with soft black to add little eyebrows, and then I'll also go in and paint his mouth. If that paint is nice and thin, it should flow on smoothly and you won't have to reload. If you have to reload often, you don't have enough water, enough moisture on your brush to really allow it to flow. I've loaded my number 6 or my number 10 diverse dry brush with Tea Berry, wiped it heavily off on a paper towel, and then I can go in and just softly start to build those cheeks with a dry brush. Once I know how much paint is on the brush, I can get a little more aggressive with my dry brush, and I just keep going over and over until I get the desired intensity. I do both of the cheeks at the same time. That way one won't be darker than the other. So I just hop back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, build them up, and they're going to be perfect. Loaded the toe of my 1/4 inch Awesome angle with Deep Midnight Blue, shading a little bit of a shadow underneath the mouth, the sides and the bottom of the eyes, below the eyebrows, around the nose. This helps to make those facial features set into the snow, and it looks like they're in his face, not just painted on top of his face. Makes a world of difference. Be careful when applying the shading underneath the eyes. Too much underneath the eyes will make him look a little bit weary. And I do put it under the eyebrows as well as the eyes and the nose and the mouth. It doesn't take much. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. I can always go back and add more if I decide that it's not strong enough. Picked up a little bit of aqua sky on my 1/8 inch awesome angle. I'm putting a little bit of a float on the bottom and right side of the eyes. This gives a little hint of color. Now I'm adding a teeny tiny little comma stroke with Snow White and my Epic script liner and a couple little dip dots in the top left. And look how those little eyes absolutely sparkle. He looks like he's up to some mischief. 3 little dip dots on the cheeks. And I always think, after I sprinkle the snow in the background, it may or may not show up, but I like that little addition. I am using Heritage Brick just to float along the bottom of the nose, pulling it up those ridges, and that helps define that look of a carrot. Just a little bit of a float. I wasn't sure on the top, so I just picked up some of the Warm Sunset and a touch of Snow White to make it brighter, and using that to highlight the top of the nose. If it gets too light, it blends into the face, so I wanted to make sure there was enough differentiation and color to highlight that and still maintain that shape of the nose. Added a little more shading with Payne's Gray underneath the scarf, and then I'm adding just a touch of it here and there on the scarf to pull that same shadow color throughout. This is not much. A little bit makes a big difference, and especially when using these dark colors, they can become so powerful and so overwhelming that it will diminish the brightness of the colors that are being shaded. To paint the Cardinal, I'm using my number 5 Radical Round and Tea Berry. It makes a really nice base to build on, and I'm painting the sections separately. So I'm painting his head, his body, and his wings. I'm using little strokes, and they're not solid and heavy. And with this darker background, it looks like little feathers with my brush strokes. And I like the way that looks, letting that background show through a little bit. I'm letting that work for me so I don't have to work as hard. Picked up just a tiny bit of baby duck to put the beak in. And I'm using my Epic script liner. Going back with True Red, I want this to be a red Cardinal. So I'm bringing in those colors, those bright colors. And I don't want to say I top coat the entire bird. I pretty much do, but I'm still using, I'll call them feather strokes. I'm going with the shape of the wings, building those little feathers in there. And you can see when it dries, all the colors, the dark colors, the light colors show through. I've loaded my Epic script liner with soft black to paint that little facial mask around on his face, and switched over to Black Cherry to start pulling the shading in. Still, I'm not doing this super heavy. I want to just keep this very light. And you can see that I have a lot of moisture in my brush. I can move the paint around. Just defining these different sections on the bird, making sure his head shows up. And this is so simple, just a few little floats of color for highlighting and shading. Now I'm going back in with a little bit of that tea berry to brighten up his shoulders on his wings. And see how that makes that reflection. Just picking up some raw sienna. I'm going to dip dot his eye. After it dries, I'll go back and put a soft black pupil in there. Just using my Epic script liner to really define that mask on his face. Picked up a little bit of raw sienna to shade that beak, and add a little tiny highlight on the top with Snow White. Make sure that beak has a nice shape to it. Pulling a bit of Snow White on the tail, top of the wing, and I just use my finger to soften that down. And it doesn't take much, and it looks super bright, but when it dries, it almost disappears. Here's the soft black pupil right in the center of that little tiny eye, picking up just a hint of tea berry, and I'm adding some highlighting in there. You got to check the highlights and the shadowing, make sure they balance out. Now I'm going with my number 5 radical round. I'm very loosely just painting in the pine branches, and I don't want this super solid because I have a lot of layers to put on, but I'm letting it just flow off of the brush, keeping a light touch, keeping those pine needles not too thick and heavy. And because I have so many of them, I did speed this up a little bit, but it doesn't take long. It's just let it be very loose. I'm almost using the rotation of my wrist to pop those pine needles in. Now I'm loading my number 5 radical round with Hauser medium green. If you're not familiar with my line of brushes, I have some fabulous brushes that do amazing things, and I tell you, they make painting, they take the work out of painting. The radical round has a nice fat belly. I don't have to reload as often, and I have a nice sharp point on it. I can press down and get a thicker, heavier coverage. It's just a very versatile brush. So I'm just going to go in. I usually do the center vein first, and then I can go in and add those little points. And I didn't want these holly leaves to all be the same, so I'm letting them not be perfectly shaped because that gives you a different look on how they're positioned. And just go in there and add those in. I want to make sure that this first layer it doesn't have to be solid, it just has to be smooth. I've loaded my number 10 Fantastic Filbert with burnt umber and basically painting in an egg shape and using the chisel edge to pull the look of scales from the side and then down the middle. So I'll just paint that egg shape and make that nice and smooth. Then I'll go in with the chisel edge and kind of stagger those so they're not all in a row. Almost like laying bricks. You want them staggered. And that just gives the look. I will go back and add more to it, but we'll just start with that. I've loaded my Epic script liner with Thicket, and I'm adding another layer of more defined pine needles on. And this is where it starts to look real delicate. Had I not had that heavier base behind it, it would be a lot of work to fill this in. But by using that black-green base, it just makes it super easy to pop these needles in very easily, very quickly. Thin that paint down, allow it to flow off the brush without a lot of work. That way you know that they're going to be nice and slender and perfect. And I'm doing the same thing up above. I'm putting the black green in with the number 2 radical round around the all the greenery on the hat, just letting that flow on there. Let that nice dark base in there, and I gave it a quick dry. Now I'm going to go back with Thicket to add those defined needles. I kind of forgot about the greenery at the top. I like to paint all of the same things at the same time, and that way they look the same instead of like an afterthought. Going back in now with the number 2 radical round to paint the smaller holly leaves on the hat, and I did downsize them so it wouldn't be so heavy up there. And this is Hauser medium green. And the holly leaves can be I like them when they're a little bit curved instead of straight. I think that looks a little more natural, and it gives a little more interest as well. If you have any comments or questions, make sure you put them in below. I'd love to hear from you. I'm using baby duck to add a little design on the scarf. I wasn't sure I was going to, but it looked pretty empty, so I was glad I did. This really brightened it up nicely. In fact, it really brightened it up a lot. So I decided that it needed to be toned down a little bit. Picked up some raw sienna. Just going to top coat where the folds are. It just takes that brightness away, but it doesn't cover up that yellow. And it creates that nice shaded look. You can see how that tones it down. Anywhere there's shading, I just put a little bit of that raw sienna kind of at the top below his face and in the middle where it folds, and then at the bottom. And I thought that baby duck was so pretty that I needed to add some other places. So I'm putting a few little highlights on the Cardinal. Love how it's looking. I do use my fingers a lot to smoosh down the color if it's too intense. Put a little bit on the hat band and a little bit on the scarf. Look how bright that becomes. Next, I'm picking up some Hauser dark green on my 1/4 inch awesome angle. And I'm basically shading the base of the holly leaves and down the center vein. And kind of blocking the colors in right now. Make sure that that base coat of the Hauser medium green is nice and smooth. It doesn't have to be perfect by the time the shading and highlighting are added. As long as it's smooth, it will just really give a lot of texture if there's a little bit of variation. Just float that in. And again, my paint is very loose, so I can work with it. And sometimes I have it so loose that there's a little too much water and I don't get a whole lot of color out of it. But I can always go back and add more, and I'd rather do that than try to figure out how to remove excess paint. And you can see how that starts to tone those leaves down. It looks really nice. This was such a fun design, and I was excited as it just really, his little face glows, and the reds came out so strong and Christmassy. I really was liking the color combination. I hadn't used this before. So it's always fun to play and try something new. And I'm just adding that hint of shading. Not too worried because I can go back and fine tune those edges. I try to be careful, but I'm not too fussy that it just takes forever. I know what can be fixed and what you need to be a little more aware of. Highlighting mostly those top edges and then right down the opposite side of that center vein. Really, this is Hauser light green. No, I'm sorry. Yes, Hauser light green. I did use I think I ended up with 5 or 6 different colors of greens. And I think just that little bit of color added in layers just makes such a world of difference. And it's nice to mix it up a little bit. Kind of look at it and you think you've got all the highlights added in, but look how those leaves just absolutely come to life. Just that hint of color. And I'm using my 1/4 inch awesome angle. Has a little more length on it than a traditional angle, which gives me a longer stroke. That means I can paint more and reload less often. And that's going back, just defining those areas of using the chisel edge of my brush just to sharpen those up. And I went back with a little bit of the Hauser medium green to add another layer of pine needles in the branches. They were looking a little bit too blue, and I wanted to ramp up the saturation of color with that a little bit. And with each layer of pine needles, it just requires a little bit less. Make sure that paint flows off very nicely, very fluidly. If not, add a little more moisture to the brush. And look, I don't go over top the previous needles, I just add more. So to me, this is very enjoyable. It's a lot of fun. You don't have to be fussy. You just lay more pine needles in, and the difference is amazing with just this little bit of color. And up here on the hat, because the pine branches are much shorter, it's just a few little strokes, and that way they're filled in just nicely. And what a difference that little bit of green makes. Now I'm going in with matcha green, and look at this amazing difference. This color is dynamite. I'm telling you, it really, the scarf, the bird really resonate and glow, and I want to make sure to pull that same glow into the other elements. So adding this matcha green in with the holly leaves just brings them up to that same level of brightness. And again, when it dries, it'll tone down quite a bit. But look at what a difference that makes. I bumped down to my 1/8 inch awesome angle on the leaves on the hat because they were smaller, and sometimes I like to go with a bigger brush, but sometimes it just gets a little cumbersome in tiny areas, and I do bump down to that smaller brush. But with my 1/8 inch angle, I have that longer bristle, and it just makes such a world of difference in that stroke. I can do the entire leaf without reloading. And for continuity, that is priceless. Look how those leaves just pop out. It's almost kind of magical. This is the kind of fussy work I like to do. And really, it doesn't take much. Now I'm loading my filbert with raw sienna, and I'm just touching on the tips of those scales. And if I just touch lightly, I get this little half moon shape, and it's just absolutely perfect for those scales. And I can really highlight where each one goes. And I'm being careful with placement because I don't want straight rows all the way down. I like to stagger them a little bit, and I can have some, and then I just kind of touch, touch, touch. On this one, I turned my brush upside down, so the one on the left, the little scale's kind of a frown. The one on the right, it's more of a smile because I flipped my brush around. And so that gives you a different direction on the way you view the pine cones. One you're looking into, the other you're looking at the side of. Picking up just a little bit of spa blue, add some highlights on those pine needles. Look at how they glow. That is just so much fun. They really start to jump out. And with all this darkness, and the background's dark, everything's dark, so these little pops of highlight and color are just so critical on bringing this dimension out and adding a lot of interest. And I just go super fast because my brush is loaded perfectly. This is my Epic script liner. It's a little bit longer than a liner, shorter than a script. Excellent control. I get a nice long stroke. Again, if you don't get a nice long stroke, you may need more moisture added to your brush. And just a few. It doesn't take much. A little bit of paint makes such a big difference. Look how that really makes those show up. And having that Hauser medium green on those pine needles made a huge difference. I don't think it shows up as much on camera, but I'm going in now with matcha green and my Epic script liner just to add the little veins. And this is such a simple little detail, but wow, these are the little details that really make a big difference. A lot of the fussy work I can kind of move around and not have to worry too much about it, but something like this. The eyes are another detail that you need to slow down and take time with. But adding the sharp edges, that bright pop of color, the veins just makes that big difference that always creates that wow factor. And you can see what just that little bit of line work, look how pretty that becomes. And it looks very intricate and very detailed, and all I did was add a few little lines on that. Look how that really stands out. And again, my paint is very thin, so I should be able to really pull that paint down. If not, I don't have enough water on my brush. And I could do all of those without reloading. And then I can go back and sharpen those. I'm going to sharpen up and really highlight any part of the leaf that I want to bring forward. And that's just going to make that light bounce off of it. And that shadowed background, all of a sudden it just really, that leaf lifts off. And even on the part of the leaf that may be a little bit in the shadow area, if I go in and just kind of define, see how empty that bottom edge is? I don't have to do all of it, but I can just add a little bit of an edge on there, pops that right out. Up here, just a little dark on that right side and on that underside. And this is not a solid line, just a little touch here and there, but look how it brings that edge of the leaf, lifts it off of the background perfectly. These are the details that make such a big difference. A little bit of spa blue, and I'm just going to touch on the tips of the pine cones, and you can see I flipped my brush around to do I did the top layers one direction, then flip my brush around to do the next layer on this one. So I've got little smile scales, and I did all of them, but this is spa blue. It's going to dry a lot quieter. On this one, I'm not flipping my brush. I'm just going to have the little frown scales all the way down. And if you don't like the way your scales are, you can kind of adjust them a little bit with the highlights. I think I added a couple extra ones in there just to kind of break up that. It was a little bit too samey. Picked up a hint of soft black. I'm going to shade the bottom and the right side and in between to kind of create more contrast and separate them just a little bit. And this is just a hint of color. Using my chalk pencil to kind of decide where I want my berries to be. And I love the chalk pencil because it's the Bond pencil, and I'll put it in the links below, but it erases with water. So if I don't like where it's at, I just take a damp brush and wipe them off. But it gives me a very strong visual on, or you can use your finger to wipe it off. It just gives a really strong visual on placement, and that way I don't have to go in and paint it and then wonder if I have it in the right place. And I use this a lot. You can see I traced around that border frame around the edge of the plaque so that I made sure that my elements weren't behind where the border was going to be positioned. But this is a great way to see if what you're going to do is going to work out. Then I can paint with confidence. I love my Painter's Pal template, and I think I have 12 or 13 of them. They are excellent because they are just, I have trouble painting circles, and this just really makes me look good. Every time I use it, I do wipe it off so that the edges don't become thick with paint, and I still maintain that nice sharp circle. But also if I wipe it off, because the stencil is translucent, it's great for placement. So I decided on these berries I would stagger the sizes of them. So I use, I think, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 different sizes. Again, it's just something that's going to add a little more interest. And if they're not all the same size, it's just a little more fun. When I load my spectacular stencil brush, this brush is amazing. It's a soft bristle brush. If you haven't tried my stencil brushes and you struggle with stenciling, this may be your perfect solution. I load my brush, wipe it on a paper towel to remove excess paint, and every time I stencil, it will be absolutely perfect. I'm not going to get the paint that runs underneath the stencil. Also, because it is a very soft bristle, I get almost an airbrush effect. I can pounce it to get more opaque, and I can dry brush it to get, or swirl it lightly to get that dry brush effect. It's just a great template to work with, and I can switch all those sizes around. This is great for eyes, bubbles, berries, marbles. It's just perfect for so many different things. I picked up Snow White, and I'm going to use that same number 10 filbert to pile a little bit of snow on some of the scales that are sticking out a little bit further, the ones that will gather the snow. Also, this will help to highlight and create a little more dimension. Just touching the edge on the ones that are like on the curve. And again, I flipped my brush around so that the pine cone looked more like you were looking down on that one. And just tapping in a little bit of Snow White to create that frosty, snowy appearance. And it just takes a very light touch. The harder the touch, the thicker the line will be. I loaded my number 6 diverse dry brush with Snow White, wiped it off, and I'm just dry brushing a few highlights on the hat and the scarf. Love this brush. The texture that it achieves is amazing. Super easy. Put a little bit on the brim of the hat. What a world of difference. It just creates a very subtle highlight. Love the way it turns out. As much or as little, it's very easy to control. Loading my Epic Script liner with matcha green, and I'm going in to add the center vein and the little veins on the holly leaves. Another tiny detail that makes a big difference. With that little bit of stroke work or line work, it makes these holly leaves look very intricate. I am using my Painter's Pal template, my spectacular stencil brush. This is a size number 4, and I'm using True Red to top coat all of the berries. Because this is so very repetitive, I did speed up the video on this section, but remember to ensure clean, crisp lines. After reloading the brush, always wipe it over a paper towel to remove the excess paint. Having the brush overloaded is a perfect way to cause that paint to seep under the stencil, and that's when the edges get rough and uneven. Please remember to give me a thumbs up if you're enjoying this video and subscribe. That way you won't miss out on future videos. If you have a comment or a question, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And again, I'm just using different sizes of the stencil. Now I'm going back in with my 1/4 inch Awesome Angle and Scarlet, and look how this makes those berries just resonate and become so beautifully vibrant. I'm just floating the top left side, kind of pulling it toward the middle. That way they're going to really glow. This is a beautiful color, but remember it needs a more opaque base because it's leans a little bit on the translucent side, which means any color underneath of it is going to kind of affect the intensity or the saturation of that scarlet. And it just takes a real simple float to look how beautiful those berries are. Picking up some of the raw sienna on my Epic script liner, just going to make little connecting branches for the berries that are not clustered, so they're not free floating. And I decided to add a little bit of a kind of a little twist at the end, just a little more decorative, and curling that up. Now I'm going back with a little bit of Snow White just to highlight those little branches, because that blue is pretty much the same tone as the raw sienna. They don't stand out really well. So always need to look for contrast. Is there a way to make it stand out and be a little more prominent? Picked up some of the deep burgundy to shade around the bottom and the left side of the berries. And I'm using my 1/4 inch awesome angle, and I'll probably drop down to the 1/8 inch. Sometimes that's a little more comfortable for the smaller berries, just to have a little more control. But this really brings in a deep red. It just really resonates well with that true red. Look how pretty and bright those berries are. Picked up a little bit of black green, and this is what I'm going to use as my magic shade color. Anywhere anything in the greenery overlaps or shadows, I'm going to float a little bit of that black green in there. And look how it cleans up those outer edges, pushes those pine branches away from the holly leaves, lifts them out. And I'll just very carefully use the toe. I'm using my 1/2 inch angle. I want a softer float. I do have quite a bit of water in my brush. I'm going to go between the berries, anywhere that it looks empty or flat. This is a really great way to enhance that and bring out that shadowing. And it just takes my motto, a little bit of paint to make a big difference. Don't have heavy paint on my brush, but I can use that toe to encourage that paint to go in all those little nooks and crannies very, very easily. Then I can lean back on the clean heel of my brush to soften any edges that become a little bit too overpowering. And you can see I'm just going to pull a little bit of shading under those berries. This will be on the snowman himself, and that just creates that dimensional look. And I'm trying to mimic the uneven edges of the pine cone down on the shading against the pine cone. I bumped down to my 1/4 inch angle, and believe it or not, this black green looks really good on these berries, but it's a very overpowering color, so be careful and make sure that it doesn't diminish that red and make it too dark. I'm putting it all around the berries, at the base of the pine cones, and just really paying particular attention. This is the part that takes a little bit of fussing. I love this part because it's almost kind of magical. Everything just really starts to evolve and become very dimensional, and it's like, wow. Picked up a little bit of Snow White on my Epic script liner, putting a little comma strokes. Normally I put maybe just a little blotch on the berries, but I know I'm going to splatter snow, so the comma strokes are going to be differentiated a little bit more from the snow splatters, if that makes sense. It just kind of keeps that a little bit different. I did go back and dry brush a little bit of Snow White on the berries with the number 2 diverse dry brush. This is my very, very favorite part. I'm taking a hint of aqua blue on the toe of my 1/4 inch angle, and I'm using that in the shaded areas. The shaded areas are very dark, and this is just a subtle hint of color, but look how it cleans up those outer edges of the holly leaves that otherwise would be just kind of in the dark. But I can enhance those, and they stand out, and they have that cool shading effect. I put it on the berries, a little bit on here and there. That's my favorite word, here and there in the shaded areas. Look at the bottom of the hat, how dark that is. I can take just a touch of that aqua sky, and look what it's going to do. Just really, all of a sudden, it's very distinct where that hat is. It looks good on every color. Look how it transforms the scarf, just makes it kind of frosty, and that shading is just absolutely stunning. This is my favorite part of the design, is adding this aqua sky. I put some sort of blue in almost all of my designs now because it's such a subtle, powerful element that really makes a big difference. And it's amazing how this little tiny hint of paint can transform and pull out and just change the total atmosphere of the design. It looks good on the red, it looks good on the blue, it looks fantastic on the green. Look how it makes those leaves really stand out. Be careful, don't overdo. A little bit makes a big difference. That is too heavy, but I'll go back. It's very loose. I'll go back with a clean brush, soften it out, and pull it down. And when it dries, it won't be quite as intense, but it can become same as anything. If there's too much of it, all of a sudden it just becomes too busy. And I added on those pine cones in the shadow scales a little bit of that aqua blue. The scales are there, but look as I put that aqua blue on there, how it fills it out and makes it look more like a pine cone. Picked up some snow white on my number 2 radical round to start piling snow on the top of the hat. Switched down to my Epic script liner to just really put smaller details in there. And this little bit of snow, and think about how snow falls. It's going to hit the tops and the crevices of the berries and holly leaves and all of the greenery. But also take a look at where maybe it's super dark and you can pile a teeny bit of snow in there just to enhance it. Look how beautiful and bright that makes it. All those little dark areas. On the tips, there's not going to be nearly as much snow piled up, so I kind of honed back on that. And I let it pile heavier on the top, kind of drip off the sides. And I'm using pressure on my brush to achieve it, so I'm not really painting it on. I'm letting the brush lay it in according to the amount of pressure that I apply. So if I want it heavier, I press down, and I can use the toe of the brush to add a little more detail. But honestly, look how that separates it from the scarf. Just let the brush kind of pull that down. Not every berry needs to have a ton of snow on it. Maybe some of it fell off of some of them. Maybe some was in a place where a little more snow collected. So kind of think about how snow lays in. Put a little bit of frosty snow on those pine branches. Look what that does to them. All that detail just makes it pop. Very minimal strokes. There's not a lot, maybe 4 or 5 on these little tiny branches. It doesn't take much to make a difference. This paint is thinned down. It's super thin. So as it dries, it won't be as intense as it looks when it's first wet. So I can go back if I need to add just a little bit more. I don't want to add too much white down in the darker areas. I prefer to have that brightness on the tips of the branches where the snow, it makes more sense for it to collect. Trying not to go past where the border edge is on the frame. So I'm kind of being careful about, and that's why it was important to trace around that border in the beginning so I know where my borders edges are. I'm loading my splatter brush with Snow White. Always, always, always test it on the palette before applying it to the surface. I love this brush because I can hone in exactly where I want it to land. I don't get my fingers messy. It's kind of like a shotgun. Wherever you point it is where the snow's going to go. I have much better control if I stand up and point it down. I know it looks like I'm sitting down, but I'm standing above the plaque and pointing it down. I don't want a lot of snow on his face. Now I'm just going back to kind of fuss a little bit so that snow looks a little bit brighter. I'm using a wedge cosmetic sponge to do the border. It's a super dense, super flat sponge, and if I lightly tap it or rub it, the side edges will remain clean and I won't have to worry about painting them. If you like, you could paint them the same color, but the reason I want it to stay unfinished is because I'm going to add glamour dust to the top and I don't want the sides to be unfinished. Picking up, that was Spa Blue, I'm picking up Aqua Sky and I'm tapping it on. In my mind, I want it to look very frosty, and I'm using different shades of the turquoises and light blues to create that. Picking up a little bit of white, and I did not clean my sponge. I'm letting them softly blend together, and by doing a tap, it almost becomes kind of mottled and creates, maybe like a frosted effect. And checking it, look how pretty that is, just the perfect color. To do the snowflakes, I'm using my Sparkle Pal, which is another template from my painter's tools. And I went in with my chalk pencil and kind of put an X where I wanted my snowflakes to be. But I found out if I use Snow White paint that I have to put 2 coats on. So I am using white Adirondack chalk paint. 1 coat makes it super opaque. As soon as I stencil it, I top coat it with the crystal glamour dust. That way I don't have to go back and try to match up my stencil to the snowflake. Usually when I stencil the snowflakes, I try to spin them so that the tines are not directly north, south, east, west. They have a little bit of a spin to them, so they're not just straight up and down. That way, if they're not perfect, they're not noticeable. And I did stagger the sizes of these, and you can see the X's on the plaque where I wanted the snowflakes to be. And I put that on there with the chalk pencil, the white one, so that it would come off very easily. I did varnish the plaque before I added the snowflakes and the glamour dust. And because this chalk paint is so thick and heavy, I don't have to worry so much about cleaning my stencil brush off. I do lightly brush it, but I found out too, because it is so thick and heavy, it was a little bit harder to do my dip dots. So I would probably recommend dip dots with the Snow White acrylic paint. But doing anything that you want white and super opaque, oh my goodness, this white Adirondack paint is amazing. And I'm just going back now with my Epic script liner, and I'm top coating the snow on everything. And I'm putting a little bit of glamour dust on it. And I keep a paper underneath my where I add my glamour dust so I can funnel it back into the bottle, and I'll show you how I do that as we get to the end. but it keeps my area from getting, oh, it always gets glittery, but it kind of keeps it from becoming all over the place. And then I don't waste a lot of glitter. I've had this same bottle of Glamour Dust for quite a few years. Believe it or not, the amount used to create the sparkle is minimal. I decided to get out my glitter duster. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very awesome tool. You fill with Glamour Dust, and then it has a little pump, and you just pump it and it poofs out just a real fine mist of glitter, and it puts an even coat on. I should have used that earlier. It's so much easier to control, and I think you can kind of see how it sprays out just very, very softly. And it's a wonderful way to apply the Glamour Dust. And I'm just tapping right now, but after it dries, I can go back and gently, there it goes. See how it mists that out, just really nice and soft. After it dries completely, I will use a very soft brush and just very gently brush the excess glitter off. And because I varnished it before I added the glitter, it is good to go. And I did the same thing with the frame, and I didn't film that, but I took the flat cosmetic sponge and I just tapped varnish over top of the frame. This is where I funnel it back into the bottle, and then I added my Glamour Dust. I love how this turned out and hope you learned a few new tips, tricks, and techniques to make your painting life a little easier and a lot more fun. All of the supplies used are listed in the links below. Whether you are a beginner or experienced painter, I'm sure you're going to love this project. If you are enjoying this video, please like, hit the bell, and subscribe. That way you won't miss out on upcoming tutorials. I would love to hear from you, so let me know if you have any comments or questions. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.